Chapter 9. We always had a summer vacation. My favorite childhood memories of summer were a trip in the car with my mom and dad. They made sure that we had a vacation each year. Not every kid in the neighborhood was that lucky. Some of my schoolmates hardly got out of town. There were a few families where the dad worked at a big factory in town and could afford to go on vacation. My Uncle Fred and Aunt Josephine Kennelly, who lived next door with 4 daughters, could manage a vacation since Fred had a good job at the General Motors plant. With me being the only child made it more easy for us to manage on what my dad made at Eisner's Grocery. Speaking of a trip in the family car, our car seemed to always have some sort of issue en route. I'm sure it ran fine before the trip, but these unexpected breakdowns really came at a bad time. There were things like the fuel pump would quit and needed replaced, or the carburetor needed repaired. That meant an expense not planned at a garage, and a delay. Then maybe a tire problem, or overheating. I'm sure glad that cars got more reliable over the years. This is probably why my mother always wanted me to have a new car, or the best I could afford as I got older. Our vacations always were to a place where we could enjoy the water. Places we visited were Lake of the Ozarks, Kentucky Dam and Lake, and even out to Virginia Beach. For my mom and me, we got the worst sunburn of our lives. Most trips were just the three of us, but a few times we invited a relative to join us. One trip to Gatlinburg and the Smoky Mountains, my cousin Donnie Treadway came along. We had a good time together. The first night at the motel in Gatlinburg, there had been a big storm that blew the deck chairs into the pool. The manager gave us a dime apiece to dive down and get the chairs out of the water. Fun, fun. On another trip to Kentucky Dam, we had my cousin Joyce and her mother Ruby with us. We had to be pretty crowded in the car and that cabin. It was fun for all of us, and I'm sure it was a long, overdue trip for Joyce and Ruby. My earliest memory of a vacation was the one with my Uncle Max and Grandma Palmer. I think the car belonged to my Uncle Max, but I think that my mom had bought it for him when my mom and dad first got married. It had 4 doors, but the back doors opened from the front to the back that were called suicide doors. As we were driving on the highway, my grandma and my mom and I were in the back seat. I had accidentally hit the door handle and the door came flying open, with me hanging halfway out of the car. They don't call them suicide doors for nothing. The wind catches those back doors and throws them open, along with everything close by. After all the screaming and yelling, we got slowed down enough to get me and the door back in place. That trip was actually a fishing trip to Canada. My Uncle Max was an avid fisherman, and I'm pretty sure this trip was his idea. My dad also loved to fish, and going to Canada to catch those big ones was a real treat. What I remember about the trip was that we went through International Falls to cross the border. Then it was on to an area where there were real Indians and a resort with cabins at a lake. There are a few pictures in my parents' albums showing some of the surroundings and the stringers of fish. I remember fishermen coming up the gravel path from the docks with stringers of fish over the shoulders and the tails of big fish dragging on the ground. They were headed to the ice house where there were blocks of ice, bales of straw, and sawdust where they could preserve their catch on ice for the rest of the week. There were 2 events that need to be told about that trip. The first had to do with that gravel path that led from the cabins up on the hill, down to the boats at the docks on the water. My mom was down on the dock along with my dad and Uncle Max. Then there was a big splash in the water right by the dock. My mother started screaming and going crazy, yelling for me. She thought that I had fallen in the water. She was very frightened and didn't see me anywhere. I was at the top of the path and had rolled a large boulder down into the water. I started yelling, and it did take her breath away as she figured out that I was okay. The second event happened as we were crossing back into the U.S. at the border. My Grandma Palmer had bought a fancy whole-smoked ham at one of the trading posts near our lodge right before we started back. It was about the biggest chunk of meat I had ever seen. As we were clearing customs, the agent informed her that there was a quarantine on ham from Canada and we could not bring it into the country. We sat in the car at the border rest area eating ham sandwiches until it came out of our ears. There were other vacations with my parents as I got older. One of them was in 1964, the year I graduated from Danville High School. I had already got my first car as soon as I was 16. I picked it up from the Catlin Chevy dealer Songers on my last day of school as a junior at DHS. It was a 1955 Chevy Bel Air. The summer after graduating, my mom and dad and I took a trip in my car to Tulsa. We took my car and I drove it all the way there and back. We took my car probably because it was more reliable and classier than their car. I think we went mainly to see the new Oral Roberts University in Tulsa. My mom, along with her mother and me, had attended an Oral Roberts event in St. Louis several years earlier. I really don't remember much more about that trip to Tulsa, other than there were no issues with the car this time. There were a couple more vacations with my mom and dad and my new family, Marilyn and Michelle. Mom and Dad really loved being with them and just couldn't get enough time together. One of those trips was to Florida. I think it was to the Tampa and Clearwater area. The other one was to Kentucky Lake, which was one of my mom and dad's favorite destinations. On the trip to Kentucky Lake, we stayed at or near Kentucky Dam Village. This was a resort on the north end of the massive lake. There were several things there to do that we all could enjoy. There was a beach and amusement park where Marilyn and Michelle loved to spend the afternoons. My dad and I would do a little fishing from the bank. Although we had a nice ski boat at home, we didn't take it along this time. The one thing that I will never forget about this trip was the horseback riding. Marilyn and I took a ride one afternoon through the woods along the lake. It wasn't long afterwards that Marilyn came down with this terrible case of poison oak. It was so bad that we had to take her to a nearby town and find a doctor's office to get some relief. We all felt so sorry for her. Not a good ending to what was a great vacation. There is one more story I want to tell. The first summer after we lost Marilyn, I took Michelle on a trip to Disney World in Florida. It had been open for only a few years and was on everyone's list to visit. Michelle and I headed out in our 1969 Pontiac GTO. It was a sports model, but did a great job on the highway, too. Our first stop was to visit very dear friends of mine in Lookout Mountain. They used to live in Decatur, but moved there just a year or two before. I had met Warren Ader while I worked at Eisner's. He delivered dairy products to our store 3 times a week. We got to be such good friends that he and his wife Joyce named their son Dennis Allen after me. We drove on to Florida after one day of visiting and sightseeing around Lookout Mountain. We were on the highway the next afternoon, within maybe an hour from Disney, when we hit this terrible rainstorm. I still can feel Michelle holding on to me from the back seat as her eyes were glued to the windshield where you could see nothing but heavy rain. We had to pull off the side of the road for a while until the storm had passed. These rains in Florida happen about every day, last for about 10 minutes, then the sun comes out and bakes you again. We soon arrived at our hotel. It was the Americana Dutch Inn right in Disney World. It was brand spanking new and it served us well as we spent the next few days enjoying Disney World. This was just what we needed at this point in time. What a wonderful vacation with my daughter.